We're on page S. You can find that on the bottom of the right column. And the last thing that we discussed is pigeon in a case of Kodshim Shenifsalu. And there's a unique halach with regard to a treifa. Because normally, when we're podeh hegdesh, and we transfer the kedusha from the animal over to something else, let's say to domim, for example. So the animal itself is mutar b'achila. And the exception to that is going to be a treifa, where you can do a pigeon from now until doomsday, but that's not going to be mater achilas ha-behema, because the behema is a treifa. And we have an opinion that derives from psukim, because the Torah, when it speaks about psulei mukdashim sheniftu, it says v'achalta basa, meaning that after you do the pigeon, because again, this pasuk in Dvarim Yud Beis, pasuk Tesvav, and we looked it up on Thursday of last week. That pasuk is written in the context of Kodshim. So how can it say v'achalta? How can the Torah allow you to eat the basar if it's Kodshim? The basar Kodshim has to go on the mizbeach. So what does it mean, tizbach v'achalta basar? So we must be talking by definition about psulei mukdashim, which means that they lend themselves to pigeon. And yet the Torah says v'achalta basar, that at the end of the day, after you do the pigeon, so the zebach becomes chulin, and therefore you shecht it and you eat it. But in a case where it's treifa, so that even after the pigeon you cannot shecht it and eat it, the Torah doesn't allow for pigeon. And in the language of the Shas, that's called ein podem es hakodshim la'achilon l'klavim. Treifa, the Torah says, what does it say? L'kelav tashlichut also, right? You feed it to your dog. But not in the case of pigeon kodshim. You can't feed it to your dog. And the Torah allowed for pigeon kodshim for the sake of you shechting it and eating it yourself. As the Torah says, tizbach v'achalta basar. Here there's no tizbach v'achalta basar because it's treifa, and therefore the pigeon is excluded. And that's called v'achalta v'lo l'klavecha. There's also, by the way, which I don't know if it's relevant to us now, but we might mention it, in the same pasuk it says tizbach, and from the word tizbach, the Gemara derives v'lo giza. That when you pod an animal, let's say the animal has wool, like a sheep, and you might say, well, after they do the pigeon, I'll shear off the wool and I'll make a garment and whatever, I'll sell the wool. No, the Torah says tizbach v'achalta. It's for the sake of achila and not for the sake of giza, which means that even after pigeon, there's still some vestige of kedusha that generates an isur giza. But what's more important for us right now is that the entire enterprise of pigeon was allowed by the Torah because it will culminate in achila, and that doesn't apply in the case of a treifa. Let's just see if we, I made a note here on the bottom that there are two footnotes we didn't even get a chance to look at. On the left column, on the bottom, Kuf Tzadi Gimel and Kuf Tzadi Dal. Let's see what we can find in these notes. Nechleku Rishonim, L'shita Satosvis, Isra Achil L'Klovim, Lo Nemar Ela B'Treifa. She'ena Re'uya L'Achilas Adam, Af Behema Kshera, Shepeda'a, Arehi Kitzvi V'Ayel, Umuteres Gam L'Klovim. Wow. Truth is, this makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, we're going to see that other Rishonim reject it, but let's just focus on Shitas HaTosfos. It makes a lot of sense. The Torah is not prohibiting your specific method of Hana, meaning once the pigeon is chal, you end up with a behemas chulin, because you've transferred the kedusha from the animal over to the dominant. So the animal that you have now is chulin. What you do with chulin, that's up to you. Laissez-faire. You want to feed it to your dog, that's fine. What the Torah is telling you here, v'lo leklavim, is telling you about pigeon. It's halach in the original ikar pigeon, that a pigeon has to be for the purpose of achilu, which means it has to be appropriate, it has to lend itself to achilu. Lafuke, to the exclusion of a treifa, where the pigeon could not be for achilu. But if it's not treifa, then the pigeon is not blocked. Why? Because the animal is ra'uyal achila. What you do after pigeon, that's your business.
But the treifa you can have achila for the bird.
Sure, you can feed it to a guy if you want.
Bring poison and give it to the guy. That's not color.
You mean he says achilus other? He should have said achilus Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. But it's not ruya. I would just cross out the word adam here because he wasn't aware of your question. It should say Eina ruya achilus Israel. You need the right, because we're saying Allah in Tizbach. Tizbach only applies to Yisrael. Yisrael can take advantage of it. It's meaningful to have shechita. So the Torah says Tizbach v'achalta, that as a result of this of the shechita, you can eat it. But if you have a pigeon which even after you shechted you couldn't eat it because it's a treifa, then the pigeon itself is blocked. But the main point here of this tosfos is that if the pigeon is not blocked, and your intention after the pigeon is to feed it to a dog, that's fine. You have a big German Shepherd that eats a lot of meat, I don't know what, and you want to feed this animal after shechita to a dog. Go ahead, b'vakasha. You did the pigeon. After the pigeon is cooling, now feed it to your dog. What does it mean below leklavim? Means that the pigeon can't be leklavim. And in the case of a treifa, since it's not royal achila, the pigeon is leklavim. But once the pigeon is valid, because it's not leklavim, because you have a behemoth shera, then the Torah says, do the pigeon, and after the pigeon, do whatever you want with the animal. You want to feed it to a dog, that's fine. Acharayvid nokat b'sfara afrucha. Shedafke b'shas pigeon hoisa asura li adam. Yesh v'adiyomar asover shemuteres l'klov. Oh my gosh, this is what you call punk fakert. What's he saying? B'shas pigeon it's asura li adam. So that should be treifa. Yeshman the Omar Hasover Shemuter. Oh, then we have a machlokes, and one opinion has it that the pigeon is valid for the sake of klov. Well, im Nesr the achar pigeon, b'shas pigeon, there was no isa, and I guess it became a treifa later on. The animal swallowed a needle. Shas pigeon hoisum teresli only divrei akol asura leklav. So the Ravid learns that v'achalta v'lo leklavecha is excluding and prohibiting giving the chulin, meaning after the pigeon, giving the animal, the flesh of the animal, to a kelev to eat. And not only that, everybody, it was unanimously accepted that you're not allowed to feed the flesh of what used to be a behemoth Kodshim, and now it's after pigeon to a dog. You're not allowed to do that. So where is the machlokes? Machlokes is in the case with b'shas pigeon, it was asura li adam. Now, I'm saying, he says dafka in b'shas pigeon oisa asura li adam. Now we're analyzing the machlokes again. If b'shas pigeon it was muteris li adam, then everybody agrees that after the pigeon you can't feed it to a dog. Well, now we're going with the Ravid again. The Roman numeral number one is Tosfos. Tosfos says it all depends upon whether it was Ru'uyel Achilas Adam. If it was not Ru'uyel Achilas Adam, then the pigeon is blocked and it's not valid. If it was Ru'uyel Achilas Adam, the pigeon is valid and you can feed the dog. The Ravid is saying just the opposite. It was never an issue. After the pigeon, you cannot feed it to a dog. Everybody agrees unanimously. You're not allowed to feed it to a dog. That which was mutter according to Tosfos, once the pigeon goes through, if it's a valid pigeon. Again, if it's ain't a really Adam, then there's no valid pigeon. But if it's really Adam and it was a valid pigeon, then take it to hey, feed the flesh of this animal after pigeon to your German Shepherd. I couldn't care less. The Ravid says everybody agrees you're not allowed to feed after pigeon. You can't feed the flesh of the animal to a dog. So what then is the machlokas? What is the Torah excluding according to one man the Omer when it says when he says that this pigeon is not valid? Says the Ravid, the machlokas revolves around a case where b'shas pigeon it was asurali adam. And here's the paradox. According to one man the Omer, you're allowed to feed the flesh of this animal after pigeon to a dog. Why? Because b'shas pigeon, it was asurali adam. In other words, the halacha that generates, according to this man, and it's only one man the Omer, that generates the isur lachilo leklavim is because you had the opportunity to eat it yourself. So it's an insult, again, I'm using Balamatic terminology, it's an insult to the Kodshim if instead of availing yourself of the possibility of eating it yourself, human consumption, instead throw it to the dogs. That's an insult to Kodshim. Again, I'm using Balamatic terms, the Saber Ta'oz. But if, on the other hand, the Shas pigeon, it was already Asurali Adam, it was a treifa at the moment of pigeon, then that pigeon could only be meaningful for a kelen, because it's a treifa. So you're allowed to feed it to a dog. When it was mutter li adam, and later on it became treifa. So now you take something which at the moment of pigeon freezes the frame, and says that it was royal achilas adam, and then you went ahead now because it became a treifa and you fed it to your dog, that's considered an insult to Kodshim. But if lu yitzur was already a treifa at the time of the pigeon, then that pigeon could only, in the best case scenario, allow you to feed it to a dog. It's not an insult to feeding it to a dog, and according to this man the Omer, you're allowed to feed it to it. The Ravid is totally different than Tosfos. The Torah says the achalta. Well, let's go back to the beginning of the pasuk. Rak b'chol avas nafshecha tizbach v'achalta bos. So let's interpret this pasuk according to Tosfos and according to the Ravid. According to Tosfos, this pasuk is addressing pigeon, and it's establishing the rules and regulations for pigeon. When is pigeon valid and when is pigeon not valid? It's only valid if it's tizbach v'achalta basar. If through the shchita you can allow this basar for achilas Yisrael, then and only then is the pigeon valid. If on the other hand there's no possibility through tizbach of v'achalta basar because it's a treifa, the pigeon is invalid. There's no problem with feeding a dog. According to Tosfos, it was never issued about taking that which was once basar kodshim after pigeon and feeding the basar to a dog. That was never prohibited. This is a pasuk that's establishing the parameters and the validity of pigeon. Pigeon only applies when this pigeon could possibly lend itself and culminate in achilas adam. But if this pigeon cannot culminate in achilas adam, why? Because it's a treifa, then the pigeon is invalid. Once the pigeon is valid, now you want to ask yourself what, right? Because it's mutar b'achila, it's not a treifa. Then you want to ask yourself a question: what do you want to do with that bus? You want to eat it for yourself, steak dinner for that night, or you want to feed it to your dog? That's your laissez-faire. That's your decision. There's no iser in feeding basar to the dog. Now comes the Ravid. And the Ravid says the following: it was never an issue. Even before we saw this pasuk, you're not allowed to feed Kodshim to a dog, even though it's after pigeon. Doesn't matter. There's a vestige of Kodshim, and it's an insult to Kodshim if you feed it to a dog. What is the issue now? The issue is if what happens if at the moment of pigeon, it was already a treifa, and it never lent itself to achilas adam. It only lent itself to achilas klavim. In such a case, the pigeon would be matir achilas klavim. Why? Because it never was a possibility of achilas adam. The achilas klavim is prohibited according to the Ravid because you had the option within the framework of that pigeon to feed it to yourself, to your family, and instead you insulted the Kodshim, downgraded it by feeding it to your dog. But if it never lent itself b'shas pigeon to achilas adam, so achilas adam was not even an option because it was already treifa, then, according to this Mandi Omar, the pigeon is valid and go feed it to the dog. Now we look at Kuf Tzadi Dal. The beer didn't say Nechleku agriz the Rav Issa Zalman Meltz. These were two greats in Kodshim. They were pretty much contemporaries. I don't know who was old, but anyway, they were about the same age. They were both steeped in Kodshim, you know. Agriz beer, Shelo Nemar Din, Sheini Yochel Liftosa Leklovim, Ella, Shalamaisa Lo Yitzur Bahem Pigeon, Lefisha Ein, Einom Shovim Klum, Liachar Pigeonum. In other words, the Britzker Rav is rejecting the simple, straightforward pshat. We said the simple pshat, that's what we discussed earlier, is that the Torah is blocking pigeon in a case where the pigeon could only culminate in achilas klavim, like in the case of a treifa. No, the Britzker Rav rejects it. There's no such din that you can't be po the kodshim for klavim. So what is this din of ein podem is hakodshim lachilul leklavim? He says lemaisa. I don't understand why dog food is not worth something on the market. But let me get back to that later. Let's just accept, Rabosai, suspend your intellectual capabilities for one moment, and let's assume that there's no market value to meat for the dogs, which doesn't make any sense. But let's just, he says, in pigeon, what you end up with is transferring the value of Kodshim Shenifsalu onto Damim. And those Damim represent the value of the basar of Kodshim on the market. Says the Brisker Rav that if it's a treifa and you cannot eat it, so therefore there's no possibility of pigeon. Why? Because pigeon means that you have to transfer its value over to the dominant, but there is no value because it's a treifa. What does that mean? It's no value. I mean, you can feed it to his dog. Pigeon. Lefisha enom shavim klum liachar pigeon. Let's read on a little bit. Lushitas hasober sheshar hanos. Eno machilus klovim mutarim. Oh, we didn't see that yet. Emes yochel liftos. Shar hanos. So again, it's not a matter of the Torah objecting to doing a pigeon for the sake of feeding klovim. but rather the Torah allows you after the pigeon to have hana, not to feed it to klavim. Bemis Yachol, according to one sheet, apparently lifdosan the tzarich shar hanos. I'm not sure what he means by shar hanos. Let's say to skin the hides and use it for leather for shoes. I don't know what shar hanos includes here, but you can be poda for shar hanos. You'll ask me, but what value does it have? The answer is that shar hanos has a market value. So therefore, the pigeon, which means to transfer it over to the domain that reflects and measures up to the market value of the basa, that's feasible because shar hanos generates a market value. What does it mean? L'maisa lo yitzur b'hem pigeon l'fi she'enim shovim klum li'achar pigeonom, because the Torah prohibits you from feeding it to a dog. So it's not what I said before, that it should have a market value because, sell it in a dog food center, right, for dogs. No. You're not allowed to do that because you can't feed it to a dog. If you can't feed it to a dog and you can't eat it, then it's valueless. And if it's valueless, then there's no possibility of pigeon, because the whole enterprise of pigeon is predicated on the fact that you transfer it over to domim that reflect the accurate value of the basar. But this basar has no value. But if you hold that shar hanos, that the Torah only prohibits feeding it to a dog, but you're allowed to use it, face to skin the hides, then enochinami, the pigeon would be valid, because then you're being quoted on a real value. Achagon Rabbi Isser Zalman Bir shenemar poseh gam din v'alocha shein podem es hakodshim lachilum leklovim. So according to the Brisker Rav, there's no objection to be poda for the sake of feeding klavim. The only thing is that the Torah says he can't feed the klavim, and therefore the pigeon would be valueless, it would be meaningless, because the basar has no value, and therefore it doesn't lend itself to pigeon. Pigeon only always means transferring its value. Whereas Rabbi Zalman Meltzer understood that ein podem es hakodshim lachil leklavim is a din, and the Torah doesn't allow you to be poda kodshim to be machal leklavim. According to Brisker Rav, the whole problem here of ein podem es hakodshim is that the pigeon won't be valid. So if I understand correctly, there'd be a tremendous nafkamina between the approach of the Brisker Rav and that of Rabbi Zalman in the case where he was poda kodshim for the sake. 1 second, what did I have in mind? If he was poda kodshim for the sake of shar hanos, according to Brisker Rav, that should be fine. You hold a shar hanos on mutarim. No. Here's the case. What happens if he's poda the kodshim in order to feed the dogs? Would such a pigeon be valid? According to Brisker Rav, it depends. If I hold a shar hanos on mutar, that generates a value, a market value to the basar because he could use it for shar hanos. Then once the pigeon is valid, then afterwards he can enjoy the benefit of shar hanos. He can't feed it to the dogs. But according to the Rebbe Zalman, the pigeon itself is not valid because his intention was to be poda the kodshim in order to feed it to the klavim. Do we have that? Shall I review that one more time for those who are interested? I mean, this is very, we're really getting heavy into the lumdus here of ein podem es hakodshim lachilum leklavim. According to the Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, that's halach. If you're doing the pigeon because your intention is to feed it to the klavim, that pigeon is invalid. That's what he calls a din v'halach, that invalidates the pigeon. According to Brisker Rav, there's no din in halach to invalidate the pigeon. What invalidates the pigeon is that the pigeon has no value to it. The basar cannot lend itself to redemption because you can't redeem it unless you have moles that reflect an equal value of the bosom. But there is no value to the bosom because the Torah after the pigeon is not going to allow you to benefit from the bosom. However, and here's the most important point in this discussion, if we go with the shita that the Torah is only excluding feeding the dog, but other anos are mutter, then clearly the pigeon would be valid. He had in mind that as a result of the pigeon, he'll feed it to the club, and that's irrelevant. The pigeon is valid. Because the entire halacha here exhausts itself in invalidating the pigeon because there's no value. But we're holding now that shara knows mutaros, and therefore there is a value. Hence, the pigeon is valid. Now the halacha would be that as a result of the pigeon, he could use the basar for X, Y, and Z. Like he could skin the hides, like we said, but he cannot use it to feed his club. Okay, so that's a summary of that footnote. Tell you my favorite story about Rabbi Zalman Milton. All these tell me that when Rabbi Zalman was in Cheder, there was another young man in the class who was sharper than he was. That's saying a lot because he was a genius. And his name was Chaim. And years went by and they parted ways. Rabbi Zalman became great Rosh Hashiva, world renowned, first in Klesk, I believe, back in Lytton, and here in Yerushalayim. And this fellow Chaim, he went into business or whatever it was. So many years later, Rabbi Zalman was sitting in his office and he hears a knock on the door. He opens the door and somebody comes in and starts hugging and kissing him. And Rabbi Zalman was taken by surprise. It wasn't the normal thing. Chaim, my gosh, my childhood friend, from the Cheder, I haven't seen you in 70 years, So as they're sitting and catching up on old times, so Chaim turns to the Rosh Hashiva and he says, in Cheder, I was considered sharper than you. How is it that you became the great Rosh Hashiva? And I'm never chaval bus, I'm eking out a living. So Mr. Salman said, do you remember Chaimka? When we were children in the freezing, snowy winters of Lithuania, we used to play sledding. Where you push the sled up the mountain and then you push down the mountain and you go down. It's a lot of fun going down. So if you remember correctly, Chaim, when it was your turn to go up, I used to push you all the way up the mountain. But when it was my turn, you didn't want to do that. It was like too much of an effort. You just wanted to go down the mountain and enjoy life. But to push up, that you didn't have. Says that's the difference between me and you. He says on the top left here on page test, pigeon is allowed for the purpose of feeding the animals. He has a different drasha. Tizbach li'achalta ein lecha bohen heter ela mishas vicha v'elech. So tizbach li'achalta is not telling you that you're only allowed to do the pigeon for the sake of achilas adam, but rather it's telling us that the heter is only after zvicha. I guess there's a time lapse between the actual pigeon and the shechita. And during that time lapse, before the actual shechita, you're not allowed to benefit from the pigeon. Okay, so this, I guess, is a sugya in Tmura, if I'm not mistaken. Again, this further proves our point from before that pigeon is not an automatic total matir. There's still something inherent in the animal insofar as it was kodshim. First of all, the fact that you can't feed it to klavim, or from the fact that giza is still prohibited. Now we see something else, that up until shchita, you're not allowed to have any benefit from this animal. It still has the status of famous kodshim, which is a fellow. When you think about it, it means that pigeon plus shchita are two segments or two elements that combine and integrate together to create a matir. The matir is not chal with pigeon. We thought, and that's the way I was always trained, you have an animal that's kodshim, and then you transfer its kedusha over to the dominant, and that's pigeon. Don't talk to me about past history. Okay, once in the past it was famous kodshim. But here we see, no, it still remains famous kodshim, and it's also by no until zvicha, till the shchita. Which means until you could actually cash in and benefit from the animal by eating its meat, but that's only after shchita. But until that point, the pigeon is, so to speak, stage one, but it's still up in the air. And it's not until the actual zvicha that we can be matir hana. So this is where we got up to for today. Tomorrow's a fast day. I hope we'll be okay. And we'll try to see if we can do it. It's still early in the day, so that should be all right. Hey, thanks. I'll put it here in my briefcase if you don't mind. So then in this way I'll know. Fine.